The training yard went silent the moment Prince Kellen dropped to his knees. 1 second he was sparring with his cousin, moving fast and sure the way he always did, and the next second his whole body locked up like something inside him had snapped. His sword fell from his hand. His eyes rolled back. Then he hit the ground, and the sound of it echoed off the stone walls louder than anything else in that yard. For a moment nobody moved. Guards who had seen battles without blinking stood frozen, unsure if what they saw was real. Then the shouting started. "Get the king, now." Word spread through the palace faster than fire through dry grass. By the time King Aldrich Draven reached the yard, his son was already surrounded by frightened soldiers who did not know what to do with their hands. The king pushed through them without a word and dropped down beside Kellen. His son's skin had gone pale, almost gray, and thin dark lines were creeping up his neck like cracks spreading across old glass. His breathing came in short, uneven gasps. Sweat covered his forehead even though the morning air was cool. "Kellen," the king's voice cracked, something rare for a man who ruled with iron control. "Kellen, look at me." The prince's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. He tried to speak, but no words came out, only a weak breath before his eyes closed again. "Move him inside," Aldrich ordered, and his voice was steady again, because a king could not afford to stay frightened in front of his people, even when his own heart was pounding out of his chest. "Careful. Now." They carried Kellen through the halls of the palace, past servants who stopped and stared, past guards who lowered their eyes out of respect and fear, past the queen, who came running from her chambers with her hand pressed to her mouth. "What happened to him?" Miriam asked, keeping pace beside the men carrying her son. "Aldrich, what happened?" "I don't know," the king admitted, and those 3 words felt heavier than any decree he had ever given. They laid Kellen on the bed in his chamber, and within minutes, the palace physician, Dr. Edmund Hale, arrived with his bag already open. He had served the royal family for over 20 years. He had treated broken bones, poison bites, and fevers that would have killed lesser men. He had never once looked as unsettled as he did now, kneeling beside the prince and pressing 2 fingers to his throat. "His pulse is racing," Hale said quietly. "Far too fast, and weak." He pulled back the collar of Kellen's shirt and stopped. The dark lines the king had noticed outside had grown. They spread from his neck down toward his chest now, thin and branching like the roots of a dead tree beneath his skin. "What is that?" Aldrich asked, his voice low and sharp. Hale did not answer right away. He leaned closer, turning Kellen's arm gently to examine the pattern. His brow furrowed deeper with every passing second. "I have never seen anything like this," he finally admitted. "It isn't wolfsbane, it isn't any poison I know. It isn't a curse mark either, not one I recognize." "Then find out what it is," the king said. "Whatever you need, whoever you need, bring them here." Hale nodded, already reaching for tools from his bag, his hands moving fast despite his uncertainty. He checked Kellen's eyes, his breathing, the strange heat rising from his skin. Every test only left him with more questions. Kellen stirred weakly on the bed, his fingers twitching against the sheets. His mother took his hand and held it tightly, whispering his name, trying to reach him through whatever darkness had pulled him under. "Stay with us," she said softly. "Stay with us, Kellen." For a moment his eyes opened again, glassy and distant, searching the room as if he did not quite know where he was. Then his back arched suddenly, his whole body tensing as a shudder ran through him, and a low sound of pain escaped his throat before he went still once more. "His heart," Hale said sharply, pressing his fingers back to Kellen's neck. Seconds stretched painfully long. Miriam gripped her son's hand tighter, her lips moving in silent prayer. Aldrich stood frozen at the foot of the bed, watching his physician's face for any sign of hope. Then Hale exhaled. "It's beating. Faster than it should, but it's beating." The queen let out a breath she had been holding, though it did nothing to ease the fear now settled deep in her chest. The king's jaw tightened. He turned to the guard standing at the door. "No one speaks of this outside these walls," he said. "Not to the council, not to the pack, not to anyone. Do you understand me?" The guard nodded quickly and left to pass the order along. Aldrich turned back to his son, who lay pale and trembling under the weight of an illness no one could name. He had built his rule on strength, on certainty, on the belief that there was no problem he could not solve if he had enough power behind him. But standing there, watching his only son fight for every breath, he understood for the first time in years that power alone would not be enough. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room, "we will find a way to stop it." Hale did not look up from his work. He kept his eyes on the dark lines spreading slowly beneath Kellen's skin, lines that had not been there that morning and now reached almost to his collarbone. "I hope you're right, my lord," the physician murmured, "because I have never seen this illness move so fast." Outside the chamber, the halls of the palace had gone unusually quiet. Servants moved with their heads down, whispering only when they thought no one could hear. Guards stood at every entrance to the wing, turning away anyone who did not belong there. The palace, usually alive with the sound of footsteps and conversation, felt like it was holding its breath. In the kitchens far below the royal chambers, a young maid named Clara Doyle set down a tray she had been preparing and looked toward the ceiling, toward the floors above where the prince's rooms sat, though of course she could see nothing from where she stood. She had heard the whispers passing through the staff like a current under the surface of still water. Something was wrong with the prince. Something serious. She thought of her grandmother then, though she quickly pushed the memory away, the way she always did. Some things were better left buried. Back in the chamber, Kellen's breathing had steadied slightly, though his skin remained pale and damp with sweat. Hale sat back on his heels, wiping his hands, his expression unreadable. "He needs rest," the physician said. "And I need to think. I have not seen a condition like this in all my years, and I will not pretend to have answers I do not have." "Then get answers," Aldrich said, his voice hard now, the fear beneath it barely hidden. "Send for anyone who might know something, healers from the other packs, scholars. I don't care what it costs or how far they must travel." "Yes, my lord," Hale said, rising to his feet. "I will send word tonight." The king looked back at his son one last time before he left the room, at the boy who would one day rule everything Aldrich had built, now lying weak and marked by something no one understood. He clenched his fists at his sides, the fear inside him hardening into something colder and more determined. Whatever this illness was, it had chosen the wrong family to attack. Night fell over the palace, but no one in the royal wing slept. Guards stood watch outside Kellen's door, though there was no enemy to guard against, only an invisible sickness they could not fight with swords. Hale returned twice more before midnight, checking the prince's pulse, his breathing, the slow crawl of the dark lines beneath his skin, which had, thankfully, stopped spreading for the moment. Miriam refused to leave her son's side. She sat in a chair pulled close to his bed, her hand resting over his, watching the rise and fall of his chest as if her attention alone could keep him breathing. Every so often his face twisted in pain, and every time it happened, her heart clenched with fear that this might be the moment they lost him. Aldrich paced the hall outside, unable to sit still, unable to do anything but wait. He was a king used to giving orders and seeing them carried out, used to solving problems through strength or strategy. But this enemy had no face, no army, nothing he could strike back against. It moved through his son's body in silence, and there was nothing he could do but watch and hope his physician found an answer before it was too late. By the time the sun rose again, Kellen had not gotten worse, but he had not gotten better either. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever rising and falling in waves, his strength fading a little more with each passing hour. Hale examined him again in the pale morning light, running his fingers gently along the lines on the prince's skin, now stretched further across his chest than they had been the night before. "They're still spreading," Hale said quietly, mostly to himself. "Slower than yesterday, but still spreading." Aldrich stood in the doorway, watching, his face carved from stone, though his heart pounded with dread beneath it. "How long," he asked, "before we run out of time?" Hale did not answer right away. He looked at the prince, so young, so strong just 2 days ago, now fighting a battle against something none of them understood. "I don't know," the physician admitted, "but I intend to find out everything I can before we do." He gathered his notes, his tools, and the small samples he had taken from Kellen's skin, and left the chamber without another word, his mind already racing through every book, every scroll, every old healer's tale he had ever heard, searching desperately for something, anything, that might explain what was happening to the prince. The palace held its breath, waiting, as the illness continued its slow and silent march through the body of the boy who would one day be king. By the third day, the palace had become a place of strangers. Healers arrived from every allied pack the king could reach, brought in through side gates under cover of darkness so no one outside the walls would see them and start asking questions. Some came on horseback, exhausted from days of hard riding. Others were flown in on private transports arranged through contacts Aldrich had spent years building, men and women in plain clothes who carried leather cases full of instruments no one in the palace had ever seen before. Among them was a human specialist named Dr. Perrin Wade, a quiet, sharp-eyed man who had built his reputation treating rare blood conditions in the human world. He had been told only that the patient suffered from an illness with unusual symptoms, nothing more. When he stepped into Kellen's chamber and saw the prince lying pale and marked with spreading dark lines, his composure faltered for the first time in years. "I need to run tests," Wade said, setting his case down carefully. "Blood, tissue, anything I can compare against known conditions." Hale nodded and stepped back to let him work, though the tension in his shoulders showed he did not fully trust a stranger with his patient. Still, he had run out of pride to spare. If this man could help, pride did not matter anymore. Wade drew blood carefully, his hands steady despite the strange markings crawling beneath the prince's skin. He worked in silence for nearly an hour, running samples through small devices that hummed softly in the quiet room, comparing results against notes he had brought with him. "There's inflammation in his blood unlike anything I've documented," Wade finally said, frowning at his notes. "It behaves almost like an infection, but it isn't reacting to any treatment I would normally use. Whatever this is, it's resisting everything." "Try something stronger," Aldrich said from the doorway, his patience worn thin after 3 sleepless nights. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care what risks come with it." Wade hesitated, glancing at Hale, who gave a small, reluctant nod. Together they prepared an experimental treatment, a combination Wade had used only once before on a case that had, at the time, seemed hopeless. They explained the risks carefully to the king and queen, warning that the prince's body might reject it violently. Miriam gripped her husband's arm. "Is there another way?" "Not that I know of," Wade admitted honestly. "But I won't force this decision on you. It's your choice." Aldrich looked at his son, at the boy who had not opened his eyes in nearly a full day, whose breathing had grown shallower with every passing hour. "Do it," he said. "We don't have time to wait for another option." The treatment began with a slow injection administered directly into Kellen's arm. For a moment nothing happened, and the room held its breath in silence. Then the prince's body convulsed, his back arching off the bed as a low, pained sound tore from his throat. "Hold him steady," Wade ordered, and 2 guards rushed forward to keep Kellen from moving off the bed while Hale checked his pulse, his face going white. "His heart rate is spiking," Hale said sharply. "Far too high." Miriam let out a cry, reaching for her son, but Wade held up a hand to stop her from getting too close. "Let us work," he said firmly, though his own voice trembled slightly with the tension of the moment. Kellen's shaking slowed after several long, tense seconds, his body going still again as his breathing settled into something almost normal. Wade checked his pulse, his brow furrowed in concentration. "He's stable," the doctor finally said, exhaling. "For now." "For now," Aldrich repeated, his voice tight. "What does that mean?" Wade straightened, running a hand through his hair, clearly troubled by what he had just witnessed. "It means the treatment did nothing to stop the illness. It only shocked his system. Whatever is inside him rejected it entirely, just like it's rejected everything else we've tried." The king's fists clenched at his sides. 3 days of searching, 3 days of the best healers money and power could summon, and still no answers, only failure after failure, while his son grew weaker with each passing hour. "There has to be something," he said, his voice low and heavy now, the frustration finally breaking through his careful control. "Someone in this world must know what this is." Hale exchanged a glance with Wade, both men clearly out of ideas, both men clearly worn down from days without proper rest. Neither wanted to be the one to speak the truth hanging heavy in the room, but eventually Hale forced himself to say it. "My lord," he said carefully, "I have consulted every text I own, every colleague I trust, and every remedy known to modern medicine. I fear we may be dealing with something older than what any of us have studied, something outside the reach of standard treatment." "Then find someone who studies what's outside standard treatment," Aldrich said. "Those who once practiced such things," Hale said quietly, "were pushed out of packs like ours long ago. Old healers, the ones who worked with herbs and moon cycles and remedies, considered superstition. Most of that knowledge was lost, or forbidden, generations back." Aldrich's jaw tightened at the memory the words stirred, though he said nothing, his mind already turning over the problem with the same relentless focus he applied to every threat against his kingdom. By the 4th day, Kellen's condition had grown worse despite every effort. The dark lines beneath his skin now reached his jaw, faint and spidery, and his fever burned hotter than it had before. He drifted in and out of awareness so often that Miriam had stopped counting the moments he was alert, focusing instead on simply being there each time his eyes opened, even if only for a few seconds. Wade and Hale worked around the clock, testing theories, running samples, trying combinations of treatments both old and new, but nothing slowed the illness's progress. Other specialists arrived and left just as quickly, each one puzzled by what they saw, each one admitting, eventually, that they had no answer to offer. One evening, as the sun sank low over the palace grounds, Hale found himself standing outside Kellen's door with Wade, both men worn thin from exhaustion and frustration. "I don't understand it," Wade admitted quietly. "In all my years, I've never seen a body reject every form of treatment this completely. It's almost as if the illness is choosing what works against it and adapting before we can strike back." "That shouldn't be possible," Hale said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Wade agreed. "It shouldn't. And yet, here we are." Inside the chamber, Miriam sat beside her son, brushing damp hair back from his forehead, humming softly the way she had when he was small and frightened of storms. He did not stir, but she kept humming anyway, needing something to hold on to in the silence. Aldrich stood near the window, staring out over the grounds where his son used to train every morning, where just days ago Kellen had been laughing and strong and full of life. He thought of every battle he had won through strength and strategy, every enemy he had defeated because he refused to accept defeat. But this enemy could not be fought with swords or armies, and for the first time in his rule, Aldrich felt truly powerless. A soft knock came at the door. A young maid entered quietly, carrying a tray of food that no one had asked for and few would eat, though it was tradition to bring meals to the royal chamber regardless of circumstance. She kept her eyes low, moving carefully across the room to set the tray on a side table without disturbing anyone. Aldrich barely noticed her, his mind still consumed with worry, but Miriam glanced up briefly, offering a small, tired nod of thanks before turning her attention back to her son. The maid lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, her eyes drifting toward the prince's pale face and the faint dark lines creeping along his jaw, before she quietly excused herself and slipped out of the room. Neither the king nor queen paid her any further attention. There was no reason to. She was simply one of many servants moving quietly through the halls of a palace, gripped by fear. Easy to overlook in the way that people often overlook those who serve them. But as Clara Doyle walked back down the corridor toward the kitchens, her mind was racing with something she had noticed, something small and strange that none of the doctors seemed to have considered. She had seen the pattern before, long ago, in stories her grandmother used to tell her when she was young. Stories about illnesses tied not to poison or curses, but to the pull of the moon itself. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining connections where none existed, that surely the finest physicians in the land would have already considered something so simple. But the thought stayed with her long after she returned to her duties, refusing to let go, growing louder with every hour that passed and every report of the prince's worsening condition that filtered down through the palace staff. By the fifth night, Hale sat alone in his study, surrounded by books and notes that offered no answers, staring at a chart tracking Kellen's symptoms over the past several days. Something about the pattern nagged at the edge of his mind, a rhythm he could not quite place, but exhaustion clouded his thoughts too heavily for him to see it clearly. Down in the kitchens, Clara stood at the window of the servants' quarters, looking up at the sky, at the moon slowly filling toward its next full phase. She thought of her grandmother's voice, warm and steady, teaching her things the rest of the pack had long since dismissed as foolish superstition. She thought of the prince's illness, and the timing of it, and the shape of the pattern she was almost certain she had seen. She was only a maid. No one would listen to her, not overtrained physicians and hired specialists from distant lands. But as she stood there beneath the darkening sky, she made a quiet decision that she was not yet ready to admit, even to herself. She would find a way to make someone listen, whether they wanted to or not. The kitchen was already busy with the clatter of pots and the smell of bread baking when Clara arrived before sunrise, tying her apron with hands that had not quite stopped trembling from the night before. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the prince's pale face, the thin dark lines crawling up his jaw, and the shape of a pattern she could not stop turning over in her mind. It matched something her grandmother, Agnes Doyle, had described to her many years ago, back when Clara was still small enough to sit at her grandmother's feet and listen to stories the rest of the world had long forgotten. Some sicknesses, Agnes used to say, don't come from poison or curses at all. They come from the pull of the moon itself, tugging at something broken deep inside a person's blood. You won't find them in any physician's book, child, because the ones who knew how to read them were driven out long before you were born. Clara had not thought about those words in years, not until she saw the prince trembling on his bed, his fever rising and falling in a rhythm that felt eerily familiar. She carried a tray of tea up to the royal wing that morning, as she always did, moving quietly past the guards stationed outside Kellen's door. She had done this task dozens of times over the years, delivering meals that were rarely eaten, setting trays down and slipping away, before anyone noticed she had been there at all. But this time, she paused just a little longer than usual, watching the prince through the open door. He lay still, his chest rising and falling unevenly, sweat clinging to his forehead despite the coolness of the room. Miriam sat beside him, exhausted, her eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. Hale stood nearby, flipping through pages of notes with a frustration Clara had never seen on the physician's face before. She noticed something then, something that made her breath catch. The dark lines on Kellen's skin seemed slightly less pronounced than they had been the evening before, faint but undeniable, and she remembered, with a jolt, that the moon had dipped behind thick clouds overnight, its light blocked from the sky. It could have been coincidence. It probably was coincidence, she told herself, forcing her feet to carry her out of the doorway before anyone noticed her lingering. But over the following 2 days, she watched carefully, quietly, every time she brought food to the chamber, and each time she noticed the same strange pattern. When the moon was hidden or dim, Kellen seemed to breathe a little easier. When the sky cleared and the moon grew brighter, his fever spiked, and the lines beneath his skin darkened. By the third night of watching, Clara could no longer convince herself it was nothing. She found herself standing outside the kitchen late in the evening, staring up at the sky, her heart pounding with a decision she knew could cost her everything. She was a maid. She had no training, no standing, nothing to offer the finest physicians in the land, except an old woman's forgotten stories, and a pattern she had noticed while carrying trays of food no one wanted. But if she said nothing, and the prince continued to weaken, she would never forgive herself for staying silent. The next morning, she gathered her courage and approached one of the guards stationed near the royal wing, a stern man named Garrick who had served the palace for as long as she could remember. "Please," she said quietly, keeping her eyes low out of respect. "I need to speak with someone about the prince." Garrick barely glanced at her. "The prince is being cared for by the finest doctors in the land. He has no need of kitchen staff." "I only wanted to mention something I noticed," Clara pressed gently, "about the moon, and how his fever seems tied to it." The guard's expression shifted from indifference to something closer to irritation. "You think you've noticed something the king's physicians have missed? A maid, watching from a doorway?" Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she held her ground. "I only wanted someone to hear it, that's all." Garrick sighed, clearly out of patience, given the tension already thick throughout the palace. "Go back to your duties. This is not something you need to concern yourself with." She wanted to argue further, but the look on his face told her it would be pointless. She lowered her eyes and turned away, disappointment settling heavy in her chest as she walked back toward the kitchens. Word of her attempt reached Mrs. Bramwell, the head housekeeper, before the day was over. Bramwell had run the palace staff for over a decade, with a firm hand, and little patience for anyone who stepped outside their place. "I heard you tried to speak to the guards about the prince's illness," Bramwell said sharply, cornering Clara in the hallway outside the laundry room. "Is that true?" "I only wanted to help," Clara said carefully. "Help?" Bramwell's voice rose slightly, sharp with disbelief. "The finest doctors in the kingdom cannot cure him, and you believe a kitchen maid holds the answer? Do you understand how foolish that sounds?" Clara said nothing, staring down at her hands, humiliation burning through her. "I don't know what nonsense your grandmother filled your head with," Bramwell continued, her tone softening only slightly, though the warning in her words remained clear. "But you will not repeat this foolishness again. Do you understand? If word reaches the king that a maid is spreading superstition about his son's illness, it will not go well for you." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said quietly, though something inside her twisted painfully at the dismissal. She spent the rest of the day carrying out her duties in silence, scrubbing floors and folding linens, her mind far away from the tasks in front of her. Every so often, whispers from other servants reached her ears, fragments of news about the prince's condition worsening, about physicians growing more desperate, about the king's temper fraying with every failed treatment. That evening, as she delivered a tray of untouched food to the royal chamber, she saw something that made her stop cold in the doorway. Kellen lay convulsing weakly on the bed, his body shaking as Hale and another physician worked frantically to steady him, Miriam gripping his hand and whispering his name over and over. The moon outside the window hung full and bright, its pale light spilling across the room, and as Clara watched, the dark lines on the prince's skin seemed to darken visibly before her eyes, spreading further than she had seen before. No one noticed her standing there, frozen, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. She watched the physician struggle, watched the queen's desperate tears, watched the prince's body fight against something none of them could name. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that she was right. The moon was killing him. She backed out of the room quietly before anyone could see her, setting the tray down on a nearby table with hands that would not stop shaking. She walked through the halls in a daze, her mind racing through everything her grandmother had ever taught her, trying to remember details she had long since let fade, remedies and rituals dismissed as foolish nonsense by everyone who had ever heard them. She had been silenced once already. She had been warned not to speak of it again. But as she made her way back to the servants' quarters that night, staring up at the same bright moon that seemed to be slowly killing the prince, Clara understood that silence was no longer an option. She did not know how she would make anyone listen. She did not know what price she might pay for trying. But she knew, more certainly than she had ever known anything in her life, that if she did nothing, the prince would not survive much longer. And she could not carry that guilt for the rest of her life. Not when she believed, however impossible it seemed, that she might hold the answer no one else had found. Clara barely slept that night, her mind circling the same question over and over. If the guards would not listen, and Mrs. Bramwell had already warned her once, who else could she possibly turn to? She thought of going directly to the king, but the idea terrified her. Aldrich Draven was known throughout the pack for his temper when pushed too far, and a maid interrupting him during the worst crisis of his life seemed like a fast way to lose far more than her position. She thought of Hale, the palace physician, but he had already dismissed every unconventional idea brought to him over the past several days, too exhausted and too proud to entertain the theory of a servant girl. By morning, she had made a decision that frightened her more than any other option. She would find a way to speak with the prince himself. It was reckless. It could cost her everything if she was caught sneaking closer to his chamber than her duties required. But Kellen, unlike the guards and the housekeeper, had always struck her as different from the rest of the royal family. Kinder somehow, the few times their paths had crossed over the years. She remembered him thanking a stable boy personally after a minor injury, remembered him insisting servants be given rest during the hottest days of summer. If anyone in that palace might actually listen to her, it would be him. She volunteered to deliver his morning tray herself, something she had done many times before without drawing attention. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried it up the stairs, rehearsing words in her mind that never quite felt right. When she entered the chamber, Miriam was resting in a chair nearby, finally overcome by exhaustion after days without proper sleep. Hale had stepped out briefly to consult with another physician. For the first time since the illness began, Clara found herself nearly alone in the room with the prince. Kellen's eyes were open, though barely, his gaze distant and unfocused as he stared toward the ceiling. The dark lines on his skin had spread further overnight, reaching now toward his cheek, faint but unmistakable in the morning light. Clara set the tray down quietly, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. She should have simply left. That was the safe thing to do, the expected thing to do. But her feet would not move. "You're the one who's been bringing my food," Kellen said suddenly, his voice weak and rough, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the empty cup in her hand. "Yes, my lord," she said quickly, bowing her head. "Forgive me, I didn't mean to disturb you." "You haven't," he said, his eyes finding hers with surprising focus despite his weakened state. "You've been standing in the doorway more than usual. I've noticed." Clara's breath caught. She had not realized he had been aware of her presence at all during his worst moments. "I apologize, my lord. I only wanted to make sure everything was—" "You noticed something," Kellen interrupted gently, though his voice trembled with effort. "Didn't you?" Clara froze, unsure how to respond. Admitting the truth felt dangerous after everything Mrs. Bramwell had warned her about, but lying to the prince, especially now, felt wrong in a way she could not ignore. "My lord, I don't have any training," she said carefully. "I'm only a maid. I shouldn't be speaking about such things." "Please," Kellen said, and something in his voice, raw and desperate, made her chest ache. "Everyone else has tried and failed. My father has brought in every physician he can find, and none of them can explain what's happening to me. If you noticed something, anything, I need to hear it." Clara glanced nervously toward the door, half expecting Mrs. Bramwell or Garrick to appear and drag her away before she could speak another word. But the hallway remained empty, and Kellen's eyes stayed fixed on her, pleading in a way that made refusal feel impossible. "It's the moon," she said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush before her courage could fail her. "I've been watching. These past few nights, when the moon is hidden or dim, you seem to breathe easier, and the marks on your skin fade slightly. When it's bright and full, like it was last night, everything grows worse. I think whatever illness this is, it's tied somehow to the moon's cycle." She braced herself for disbelief, for mockery, for the same dismissal she had received from everyone else. Instead, Kellen's eyes widened slightly, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "My grandmother," Clara continued quietly, encouraged by his silence. used to speak of illnesses like this, old sicknesses, tied to the pull of the moon, that most people forgot generations ago. She knew things about healing that the rest of the pack considered superstition. She was cast out for it, long before I was born. What was her name? Kellen asked softly. Agnes, Clara said. Agnes Doyle. Kellen closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to remember something from long ago, some story he had heard as a child perhaps, though nothing surfaced clearly enough for him to grasp. When he opened his eyes again, they held something Clara had not expected to see there. Hope. I believe you, he said quietly. Relief flooded through her, so sudden and overwhelming that she nearly wept right there in the chamber. My lord, I tried to tell the guards, and Mrs. Bramwell warned me not to speak of it again. I don't know if anyone will listen, even now. They'll listen, Kellen said, his voice firm despite his weakness, because I'm going to make them. Before Clara could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and she quickly stepped back from the bed, straightening her apron and lowering her eyes just as Hale walked back into the room, followed closely by Dr. Wade. Everything all right in here? Hale asked, glancing curiously between the maid and the prince. Fine, Kellen said, his voice steadying with visible effort. I need to speak with my father, now, if possible. Hale exchanged a puzzled look with Wade before nodding. Of course, my lord. I'll send for him immediately. Clara excused herself quietly, gathering the tray and slipping out of the chamber as calmly as she could manage, though her heart pounded wildly the entire way down the corridor. She had done it. She had finally spoken the truth to someone who might actually listen. But as she made her way back toward the kitchens, doubt crept back in, cold and heavy. The prince believed her, yes, but would the king? Would Hale, or Wade, or any of the physicians who had spent days searching for answers through proper medicine and proven science, ever take seriously the words of a maid repeating her exiled grandmother's forgotten stories? She did not have long to wonder. Within the hour, a guard appeared at the kitchen entrance, his expression unreadable as his eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. Clara Doyle, he said, his voice carrying an authority that made every servant nearby stop what they were doing and stare. The king wishes to speak with you, immediately. Clara's stomach dropped. She had wanted someone to listen, but now, faced with the reality of standing before Aldrich Draven himself, she felt nothing but pure terror at what she had set into motion. She wiped her hands on her apron, took a steadying breath, and followed the guard out of the kitchen, unsure whether she was walking toward the answer that might save the prince's life, or toward the end of everything she had ever known. The throne room felt enormous and cold as Clara stepped inside, her footsteps echoing far too loudly against the polished stone floor. King Aldrich stood near the tall windows, his back turned, his shoulders rigid with tension. Queen Miriam sat nearby, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp with curiosity as they settled on the young maid being led into the room. Also present, standing off to one side with his arms folded, was Lord Silas, one of the king's senior advisors, a thin, sharp-featured man whose expression already carried open skepticism. Leave us, Aldrich said to the guard, and the door closed with a heavy thud, leaving Clara alone before the most powerful people in the kingdom. She dropped into a deep curtsy, her heart hammering so hard she feared they could see it through her chest. Your Majesty. My son tells me, Aldrich said, turning slowly to face her, his expression unreadable, that you believe his illness is connected to the moon. Yes, Your Majesty, Clara said, keeping her eyes lowered, though she forced herself to continue despite the fear tightening her throat. I've watched him these past several nights, while bringing meals to his chamber. When the moon is dim or hidden, his fever seems to ease slightly, and the marks on his skin fade. When the moon grows brighter, everything grows worse. This is absurd, Lord Silas interrupted sharply, stepping forward. Your Majesty, we have consulted the finest physicians from across the region, human specialists with decades of training, and none of them have found a connection to something as simple as moon phases. Are we truly meant to entertain the theories of a kitchen servant over trained professionals? I only wanted to help, Clara said quietly, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. Where did you learn of such things? Aldrich asked, ignoring his advisor for the moment, his gaze fixed intently on Clara. She hesitated only briefly before answering honestly, knowing that lying now would serve no purpose. My grandmother, Your Majesty, Agnes Doyle. She was a healer, many years ago, before she was cast out of the pack for practicing remedies the council considered forbidden. She taught me things when I was young, stories about illnesses tied to old causes that most people have long since forgotten. Silence fell over the room. Aldrich's expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes that Clara could not quite read. A distant memory, perhaps, though he said nothing about it. Forbidden practices, Lord Silas said, his voice tight with disapproval, are forbidden for good reason, Your Majesty. This girl is suggesting we abandon proper medicine in favor of superstition, passed down from an exiled woman who broke the laws of this pack. I would strongly advise against entertaining this any further. The proper medicine has failed, Miriam said suddenly, her voice sharp and tired, cutting through the room with unexpected force. Every physician we've brought in has admitted defeat. My son grows weaker by the hour, and none of them have offered a single solution beyond treatments that nearly killed him already. Silas opened his mouth to respond, but Aldrich raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The king studied Clara for a long moment, his gaze heavy and searching, as if trying to determine whether the girl before him was foolish, desperate, or perhaps, impossibly, telling the truth. You understand, he said slowly, that if you are wrong, and this delays proper treatment even further, my son may not survive the consequences. I understand, Your Majesty, Clara said, her voice trembling but steady. I would not have come forward if I wasn't certain of what I've seen with my own eyes. And if you are right, Aldrich continued, what exactly do you propose we do? Clara swallowed hard, aware that the next words out of her mouth would determine everything that followed. My grandmother taught me remedies using herbs and preparations tied to lunar cycles, meant to calm illnesses connected to the moon's pull. I would need to prepare something similar for the prince. It's not something modern physicians would recognize, and I won't pretend to fully understand why it works, only that it does, based on what she taught me. You've never actually used these remedies yourself, Silas pointed out coldly. You're proposing an untested treatment based on childhood stories, on a prince whose life already hangs by a thread. Yes, Clara admitted, her voice quiet but unwavering. I have never used it myself, but everything else has already failed, and I believe, more than I have ever believed anything, that I understand what is happening to him. The room fell silent again. Aldrich turned away, walking slowly toward the window, staring out at the grounds below where his son used to train every morning. Miriam watched him carefully, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. Silas remained tense, clearly ready to argue further the moment the king gave any indication of considering the proposal. Finally, Aldrich spoke, his voice low and heavy with the weight of a decision no father should ever have to make. My son believes you. He sent for me himself, weak as he is, because he trusts what you told him. Your Majesty, Silas began, but Aldrich cut him off with a sharp look. Every physician in this kingdom has failed, the king continued, turning back to face Clara directly. Every treatment has either done nothing or nearly killed him outright. I have 3 days before the next full moon reaches its peak, and if what this girl says is true, that night may be the one my son does not survive. He paused, his jaw tightening as he weighed the impossible choice before him. I will allow you to attempt your remedy, but you will have 3 days to prepare it, and if it fails, or if it causes him further harm, you will answer for it personally. Clara's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and terror. Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you. Your Majesty, this is reckless, Silas said, his voice rising with frustration. You would risk the heir's life on the word of a servant girl repeating banned superstitions? I would risk anything, Aldrich said, his voice cold and final, if it means giving my son even the smallest chance of survival. The physicians have had their chance, now she will have hers. Silas fell silent, though the disapproval on his face remained sharp and unmistakable. Miriam rose from her seat and crossed the room toward Clara, taking her hands gently, her eyes filled with a desperate, fragile hope. Whatever you need, the queen said softly, you will have it. Ingredients, time, assistance, anything at all. Thank you, Your Majesty, Clara whispered, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from fear to responsibility resting entirely on her shoulders. As she was escorted out of the throne room, her mind raced through everything her grandmother had taught her years ago, trying desperately to recall every detail of the remedies she had learned as a child, remedies she had never expected to need, let alone use to save the life of a future king. 3 days, that was all she had before the moon reached its fullest peak, before the illness inside Kellen reached whatever terrible conclusion it had been building toward all along. She did not know if she could succeed where the finest physicians in the land had failed, but she knew, walking out of that throne room with the weight of the prince's life now resting on her shoulders, that she had no choice but to try with everything she had. Clara spent that first night awake in the small room she shared with 2 other maids, a single candle burning low as she scribbled everything she could remember onto scraps of parchment. Her grandmother's lessons had never been written down, passed instead through years of quiet evenings spent listening, watching, learning by memory, and repetition rather than any formal instruction. Now, desperately, Clara tried to reconstruct those lessons from memory alone. She remembered silverleaf, a plant that grew only in shaded, damp places, its leaves catching moonlight in a way that made them shimmer faintly at night. She remembered crushed moonstone root, bitter and sharp, meant to calm a fevered blood tied to lunar pull. She remembered a specific combination of herbs boiled slowly over low heat, timed carefully to the hours between moonrise and midnight. But there was one ingredient she could not recall clearly enough, something her grandmother had called night bloom, a rare flower that opened only under full moonlight and closed completely by dawn. Agnes had described it as the heart of the remedy, the piece that made everything else work together properly. But Clara had never actually seen it herself, and had no identified picture solidly fixed in her memory, beyond her grandmother's vague description of pale petals and a scent like rain on warm stone. She brought her concerns to Miriam the next morning, explaining as clearly as she could what she needed and what she was missing. Where would such a flower grow? The queen asked, her exhaustion plain but her determination unwavering. My grandmother mentioned it grew near shaded streams, in places untouched by regular settlement, Clara said. I believe there may be a location within the old forest bordering our territory, though I've never traveled there myself. Miriam's expression tightened slightly at the mention of the old forest. That land borders territory claimed by Alpha Roland Thorn. Relations between our packs have been tense for years. Sending anyone into that forest carries real risk. I understand, Clara said, though fear tightened in her chest at the thought. But if the flower isn't there, I don't know where else to look, and we don't have time to search anywhere else. Miriam considered this for a long moment before nodding firmly. I'll arrange an escort. Garrick will accompany you, along with 2 additional guards. You'll leave within the hour. Clara had not expected to travel into dangerous territory herself, but she understood immediately that no one else could identify the flower with any certainty, not from a description passed down through childhood memory alone. If it needed to be found, she would need to be there to recognize it. The forest bordering Thorn's territory was thick and shadowed, ancient trees rising high enough to blot out most of the daylight even at midday. Clara rode nervously between Garrick and the 2 guards, her eyes scanning the underbrush for any sign of the shaded, damp terrain her grandmother had described. We shouldn't linger here longer than necessary, Garrick said quietly, his hand resting near his weapon, as his eyes scanned the tree line constantly. Thorn's patrols have been known to cross into this area without warning. I understand, Clara said, though her focus remained fixed on searching the forest floor for any hint of pale petals, or the specific shaded conditions Agnes had once described. They rode for nearly 2 hours before Clara spotted a narrow stream cutting through a shadowed hollow, thick moss covering the rocks along its banks. There, she said, pointing eagerly. That looks like the kind of place she described. The group dismounted carefully, moving toward the stream with cautious steps. Clara knelt near the water's edge, searching through the undergrowth, her heart pounding with hope and desperation in equal measure. A low growl suddenly cut through the quiet forest air, freezing everyone in place. Garrick's hand shot instinctively to his weapon as 3 figures emerged from the tree line ahead, wearing the markings of Thorn's territory clearly visible on their shoulders. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes, stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the small group with obvious suspicion. You're trespassing on Alpha Thorn's land, he said, his voice low and threatening. State your business, or leave now. We mean no harm, Garrick said carefully, positioning himself slightly in front of Clara without drawing his weapon further. We're searching for a rare plant needed for a medical emergency. We'll be gone within the hour. The Thorn guard's eyes narrowed, studying them each in turn before settling on Clara, who remained kneeling near the stream, her hands still trembling slightly from the sudden tension. A medical emergency, from the Draven pack? What business is that of ours? Please, Clara said suddenly, rising to her feet despite the fear tightening her chest. The Alpha King's son is dying. I need this flower to save his life. I'm not here to cause trouble, only to find what I need and leave. The guard studied her for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing his next move carefully. Behind him, his companions shifted restlessly, clearly ready for a fight should their leader give the signal. The heir is dying? The guard finally asked, his tone shifting slightly, curiosity replacing some of his earlier hostility. Yes, Clara said honestly, and every physician available has already failed to help him. This flower may be his only remaining chance. The guard exchanged a glance with his companions before finally stepping back slightly, though his suspicion remained clear. Find what you need, quickly, and do not return to this territory again without proper arrangement between our packs. Relief flooded through Clara so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you," she breathed, turning immediately back toward the stream, searching desperately through the shadowed undergrowth as the tension in the clearing slowly eased, though it never fully disappeared. It took nearly 20 more minutes of careful searching before she finally found it, a small cluster of pale flowers growing low near a moss-covered rock, their petals catching the dim forest light in a way that matched, unmistakably, her grandmother's old description. "Night bloom," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief and relief as she carefully gathered several stems, wrapping them gently in cloth to protect the delicate petals during the journey home. They rode back toward the palace quickly, the guards remaining tense and alert until they crossed safely back into Draven territory. Clara clutched the wrapped flowers carefully against her chest the entire ride, her mind already racing ahead to the preparation that awaited her, the careful timing and precise combinations her grandmother had once taught her, now the only hope standing between the prince and whatever fate the moon's pull intended for him. She had found what she needed. Now came the hardest part of all, turning old memories and half-remembered lessons into a remedy powerful enough to save a life, with only 2 days remaining before the moon reached its fullest, most dangerous peak. Back at the palace, Clara was given a small room near the kitchens to prepare the remedy, along with everything else she requested. Moonstone root, delivered from the palace apothecary, silver leaf gathered from the castle gardens, and clean water drawn fresh from the well before sunrise, exactly as her grandmother had once instructed. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, crushing the moonstone root carefully with a stone mortar, its bitter, sharp scent filling the small room. She measured the silver leaf precisely, remembering her grandmother's careful instructions about proportion and timing. The night bloom petals she saved for last, knowing they needed to be added only once the moon began rising, their potency tied directly to the same lunar pull that seemed to be poisoning the prince. Hale visited twice during her preparations, his expression a careful mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. "I won't pretend to understand what you're doing," he admitted during his second visit, watching her grind the moonstone root into a fine powder. "But I've run out of options of my own, so I'll offer whatever assistance I can." "Thank you," Clara said, grateful despite the tension still lingering between them. "I may need your help monitoring his condition once the remedy is administered. I don't fully know how his body will react." "That concerns me," Hale admitted honestly. "Untested treatments can be dangerous, especially on someone already so weakened." "I know," Clara said quietly, her hands pausing briefly over her work. "But I believe this is his best chance now. I wouldn't have come this far if I didn't." As night fell, Clara added the final ingredients to the simmering mixture, watching carefully as the liquid slowly darkened, the night bloom petals dissolving completely, as the moon rose steadily higher outside the window. She followed her grandmother's instructions exactly, timing each step with careful precision, praying silently that her memory had not failed her in ways she could not yet see. By the time the remedy was finally ready, Clara's hands were shaking from exhaustion and nerves both. She carried the small vial carefully up to the royal chamber, where Kellen lay weaker than she had ever seen him, his skin now marked almost entirely along his neck and jaw, his breathing shallow and labored. Aldrich and Miriam stood waiting, along with Hale and Wade, all eyes turning toward Clara as she entered the room. "Is it ready?" Aldrich asked, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "Yes, Your Majesty," Clara said, holding the vial carefully. "It needs to be administered now, while the moon is still rising toward its peak." Hale stepped forward, his expression uncertain. "How do we know this won't harm him further?" "We don't," Clara admitted honestly, meeting the physician's eyes without flinching. "But nothing else has worked, and I believe this may be our only remaining chance." Aldrich looked toward his son, weak and fading on the bed, then back toward Clara, his jaw tight with the impossible weight of the decision before him. "Do it," he finally said. Clara moved carefully to the bedside, gently lifting Kellen's head, as Miriam helped support him from the other side. "This may taste unpleasant," Clara whispered softly to the prince, "but I need you to swallow as much as you can." Kellen's eyes fluttered open weakly, finding hers for a brief moment of trust before he nodded slightly, allowing her to carefully administer the remedy past his cracked lips. He swallowed with obvious effort, his throat working slowly, and for a long moment afterward, nothing happened at all. Then his body suddenly convulsed violently, his back arching sharply off the bed, as a strangled cry tore from his throat. "What's happening?" Aldrich demanded, rushing forward as Hale and Wade moved quickly to restrain the prince's thrashing limbs. "I don't know," Clara said, panic rising in her chest as she watched Kellen's body shake uncontrollably, sweat pouring from his skin, as the dark lines beneath his surface seemed to darken and pulse visibly. His heart rate is spiking dangerously, Hale shouted, pressing his fingers hard against Kellen's neck, his face going pale with alarm. This is worse than anything we've seen yet. You said this would help him. Aldrich's voice thundered through the room, fury and terror mixing dangerously as he turned toward Clara. What have you done? Please, Clara begged, her own voice trembling with fear as she watched the prince convulse violently on the bed. Give it time. My grandmother said, the body must fight against the illness before it can heal. This reaction may mean it's working. Or it may mean you've killed him, Aldrich snapped, his fists clenched tightly at his sides as guards moved instinctively closer to Clara, their hands resting warily near their weapons. Miriam gripped her son's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face as she watched him shake, whispering desperate pleas for him to hold on, to fight through whatever storm was raging inside his body. The convulsions continued for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only minutes, each passing second stretching Clara's nerves tighter and tighter as she prayed silently that her memory of her grandmother's teachings had not failed her, that this violent reaction truly was the illness fighting back against the remedy, rather than the remedy itself destroying what little strength the prince had left. His pulse, Hale said suddenly, his voice sharp with surprise. Everyone froze, watching him carefully as he pressed his fingers once more against Kellen's neck. It's slowing, steadying. Kellen's convulsions finally began to ease, his body going limp against the bed as his breathing, though still labored, grew steadier than it had been in days. The dark lines beneath his skin, which had darkened so alarmingly moments before, seemed to be fading slightly, retreating back from where they had spread along his jaw. Is he? Aldrich started, his voice breaking slightly with disbelief and cautious hope. Is he improving? Hale checked the prince carefully, his expression shifting slowly from alarm to something closer to astonishment. His fever has dropped, only slightly, but it has dropped. And these marks, he said, gesturing toward Kellen's jaw, they're fading, just barely, but fading nonetheless. A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone processed what they were witnessing, the first genuine sign of improvement after days of relentless decline. Miriam let out a sob of overwhelming relief, pressing her forehead gently against her son's hand. Aldrich stood frozen, staring at his son's slowly steadying breathing, the fury that had gripped him moments before dissolving into something far more complicated. Clara remained standing quietly near the edge of the room, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and relief, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. It had worked, or at least, it seemed to be working, though she knew, with the moon still climbing steadily toward its fullest peak the following night, that the true test still lay ahead of them. We're not finished yet, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else in the room. The moon hasn't reached its peak. Tomorrow night will tell us if this remedy truly holds against it. Aldrich turned toward her slowly, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes had shifted permanently from the cold suspicion he had carried into that room. Then we will be ready, he said quietly, whatever tomorrow night brings. The following day passed in a strange, fragile calm. Kellen slept for most of it, his breathing steadier than it had been in nearly a week, though everyone in the palace understood that the true test still waited for nightfall, when the moon would finally reach its fullest, most dangerous peak. Clara barely left the royal wing that day, preparing a second dose of the remedy exactly as she had the first, though this time she worked with slightly more confidence, having seen with her own eyes that her grandmother's teachings held real power. Hale assisted her without argument now, fetching ingredients and monitoring the mixture's preparation with genuine curiosity, rather than the skepticism he had carried before. I still don't fully understand how this works, he admitted quietly, watching her measure the crushed moonstone root with careful precision. But I've never seen results like what happened last night. Whatever you're doing, it's succeeding where all my training failed. I don't fully understand it either, Clara admitted honestly. I only know what my grandmother taught me, and I trust that knowledge more than I trust my own understanding of why it works. As evening approached, tension began building throughout the palace, though not entirely because of the prince's condition. Word reached Aldrich late in the afternoon that patrols along the northern border had spotted unusual movement near Thorne's territory, scouts and armed groups gathering in numbers far greater than any routine patrol required. Thorne wouldn't dare, Garrick said grimly, standing before the king in the war room as reports continued arriving, not without provocation. Provocation, Aldrich repeated coldly, such as learning that my son is gravely weakened, and that our attention is entirely consumed elsewhere. The king's jaw tightened with the realization that his enemies may have learned of his son's illness despite every effort at secrecy, and worse, that they might be preparing to strike while the pack's strongest warriors remained distracted by the crisis inside the palace walls. "Double the guards along the border," Aldrich ordered sharply, "and prepare the palace defenses. If Thorn intends to test us tonight, he will find us ready." As darkness fell, and the moon began its slow climb into the night sky, Clara made her way back to Kellen's chamber, carrying the second dose of remedy carefully in her hands. The prince was awake now, weak but alert, his eyes finding hers immediately as she entered the room. "You came back," he said softly, a faint smile touching his lips despite his exhaustion. "I told you I would," Clara said, moving to his bedside. "Tonight decides everything. The moon reaches its peak, and we'll know for certain if the remedy truly holds." Kellen nodded, though worry flickered briefly across his face. "I heard talk of movement along the border. Is my father in danger tonight as well?" "I don't know," Clara admitted honestly. "But he seemed prepared to handle it, whatever comes." As the moon climbed higher, casting pale silver light through the chamber windows, Clara administered the second dose carefully, watching anxiously as Kellen swallowed the bitter liquid. This time his body tensed only briefly, a small shudder running through him rather than the violent convulsions of the night before. "That's better than last time," Hale observed, watching carefully as he monitored the prince's pulse. "Much better." Outside, however, tension was building rapidly. A guard burst into the war room where Aldrich stood monitoring reports, his expression urgent. "My lord, armed riders have crossed the northern border. They're moving fast toward the palace grounds." "How many?" Aldrich demanded. "At least 30, possibly more," the guard reported. "Thorn's markings are clearly visible among them." Aldrich's expression hardened instantly into cold, focused resolve. "Sound the alarm. Every available guard to the outer walls immediately." Within minutes, the palace erupted into controlled chaos, guards rushing to defensive positions, horns sounding warnings across the grounds, servants ushered quickly toward safer areas deep within the palace's interior. Miriam rushed toward Kellen's chamber, fear plain on her face as she burst through the door. "They're attacking," she said breathlessly. "Thorn's forces, moving on the palace right now." Kellen, weak but increasingly alert as the second dose began taking effect, struggled to sit up. "I need to help defend the palace." "You can barely stand," Miriam said, alarmed, moving quickly to keep him from rising further. "I'm stronger than I was," Kellen insisted, though his voice remained strained with obvious effort. "Whatever Clara's remedy is doing, it's working. I can feel it." Clara watched nervously as the prince pushed himself upright, testing his strength carefully. The dark lines along his jaw, which had been fading steadily since the previous night, now looked noticeably fainter than before, and though he was clearly still weak, something in his posture had shifted, a returning strength that had been entirely absent just a day earlier. Outside, the sounds of conflict began echoing faintly through the palace walls, shouts and the clash of weapons carrying across the grounds as Thorn's forces pressed against the outer defenses. Aldrich stood at the front lines himself, directing his guards with the same relentless focus he had once applied to searching for his son's cure, now channeled entirely into protecting his kingdom. "Hold the eastern wall," he shouted, watching as his forces pushed back against the advancing riders. "Do not let them breach the inner gates." The fighting raged for nearly an hour, tense and chaotic, before Thorn's forces began retreating under the weight of the palace's organized defense, realizing too late that the Draven pack, even weakened by days of crisis, remained far stronger than they had anticipated. Back in Kellen's chamber, the prince had managed to stand fully upright for the first time in nearly a week, testing his strength carefully under Clara and Hale's watchful eyes. The moon outside had finally reached its fullest peak, its silver light spilling brightly across the room, yet Kellen's breathing remained steady, his fever notably reduced, the dark lines across his skin continuing their slow retreat. "It's holding," Hale said, genuine amazement coloring his voice as he checked the prince's pulse once more. "Even at the moon's peak, his body isn't reacting the way it did before." Relief flooded through Clara so powerfully, her knees nearly buckled beneath her. The remedy was working. Whatever ancient knowledge her grandmother had passed down, dismissed for years as foolish superstition, had succeeded where the finest physicians in the kingdom had failed entirely. As the sounds of battle outside finally faded into silence, signaling the retreat of Thorn's forces, Aldrich made his way back through the palace halls, exhausted but victorious, his mind immediately turning back toward his son's condition. When he reached the chamber and saw Kellen standing upright, weak but alert, color slowly returning to his cheeks, the king stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "You're standing," he said quietly, disbelief evident in his voice. Thanks to her, Kellen said, glancing toward Clara with genuine gratitude shining in his tired eyes. Aldrich turned slowly toward the young maid who had risked everything on the strength of forgotten stories and quiet observation, and for the first time since this crisis began, something like true respect settled into his expression. It seems, he said slowly, that I owe you far more than an apology. In the days following the attack, questions lingered over how Thorne's forces had known precisely when to strike, timing their assault so closely with the palace's greatest moment of vulnerability. Aldrich ordered a thorough investigation, unwilling to let such a dangerous breach go unanswered. The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the guards captured during the retreat, wounded and separated from his retreating companions, revealed under careful questioning that word of the prince's illness, along with details about the palace's weakened state, had reached Thorne through a contact within Aldrich's own council. Suspicion fell quickly, and painfully, on Lord Silas. When confronted in the throne room, surrounded by guards and facing the king's cold, furious gaze, Silas initially denied everything, insisting the accusation was baseless. But further investigation uncovered correspondence hidden within his private chambers, letters detailing the prince's condition and the palace's diminished defenses, sent secretly to contacts aligned with Thorne's territory over the past several days. You would sell information about my son's illness, Aldrich said, his voice dangerously quiet, to a rival alpha, while my family fought for his life? I did what I believed necessary, Silas said stiffly, though his composure had clearly cracked under the weight of the evidence against him. You were prepared to risk the kingdom's stability on the word of a superstitious maid. I sought to protect our interests through other means. You sought to protect your own interests, Aldrich said coldly, by weakening this kingdom during its most vulnerable hour. That is treason, Silas, plain and simple, and it will be treated as such. Silas was removed from the throne room under heavy guard, his position and influence stripped entirely, his fate to be decided according to the laws governing betrayal within the pack. The revelation sent a wave of shock through the palace staff and council alike, though for Aldrich, it clarified something he had been slowly realizing over the past several days. His trust in rigid tradition, in the assumption that only proper training and established authority deserved consideration, had blinded him to both the danger festering within his own council and the value hidden within a servant girl's forgotten knowledge. He called Clara to the throne room once more, this time without the tension and suspicion that had marked her first visit. Kellen stood beside his father, considerably stronger than he had been just days earlier, color fully returned to his face, the dark lines that had once marked his skin now completely faded. I owe you an apology, Aldrich said, his voice steady but genuinely humbled, a tone Clara had never heard from him before. I dismissed your knowledge, because it did not come wrapped in proper credentials or established authority. I nearly lost my son because of that same rigid thinking, and worse, I allowed a traitor to remain trusted within my own council simply because his position carried the appearance of loyalty. Your Majesty, Clara said, unsure how to respond to such an admission from the most powerful man in the kingdom. Your grandmother, Aldrich continued, Agnes Doyle, was cast out of this pack many years ago for practicing knowledge the council deemed forbidden. I have reviewed the old records regarding her exile, and I find now that the judgment against her was rooted more in fear and prejudice than any genuine wrongdoing on her part. Clara's breath caught, emotion rising unexpectedly at the mention of her grandmother's name spoken with something other than dismissal or scorn. I am overturning that judgment, Aldrich said firmly. Agnes Doyle's name will be cleared from the pack's records, and her knowledge, the knowledge she passed down to you, will be recognized as valuable rather than forbidden. Her memory deserves better than the shame this pack forced upon her. Tears filled Clara's eyes, though she fought to maintain her composure standing before the king and queen. Thank you, Your Majesty. She would have wanted nothing more than to know her knowledge finally helped someone, rather than being feared. It saved my son's life, Aldrich said simply. That alone deserves recognition far beyond a simple correction of old records. Miriam stepped forward then, taking Clara's hands warmly. You risked everything to help him, when everyone else, including us, dismissed you without a second thought. That courage deserves to be honored properly. Kellen, still recovering his full strength, stepped closer as well, his expression carrying a warmth and gratitude that went beyond simple thanks for medical treatment. You didn't just save my life, he said quietly. You reminded my father, and this entire kingdom, that wisdom doesn't only come from titles or training. Sometimes it comes from those we least expect to hold it. Clara felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. unsure how to respond to such genuine appreciation from someone she had once believed existed in a world entirely separate from her own simple life as a kitchen maid. "What would you like to do now?" Aldrich asked, "given everything that has happened? You are no longer bound to your previous duties, should you wish for something different." Clara considered the question carefully, thinking of her grandmother's forgotten wisdom, of the knowledge that had nearly been lost forever had she not remembered it when it mattered most. "I would like to continue learning," she finally said, "and perhaps, in time, teach others what my grandmother once taught me, so that this knowledge is never dismissed or forgotten again." Aldrich nodded slowly, clearly moved by her answer. "Then it will be done. You will have a proper position within this palace, resources to study and preserve whatever knowledge remains from your grandmother's teachings, and the respect owed to someone who accomplished what an entire kingdom's finest physicians could not." As Clara left the throne room that day, her heart lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future far different from the one she had once expected, a future where her grandmother's memory was honored rather than hidden, and where the quiet courage she had found within herself might continue to matter long after this crisis had finally passed. Weeks passed, and the palace slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though nothing about it felt quite the same as before. Kellen had regained his full strength, training once again in the very yard where he had collapsed, though now he moved with a quiet gratitude that had not been there before, aware of just how close he had come to losing everything. Clara's new position within the palace kept her busier than her old kitchen duties ever had. She spent her mornings studying old texts the palace archivists had uncovered, fragments of knowledge related to lunar illnesses and forgotten remedies, piecing together what remained of practices once dismissed as superstition. Her afternoons were often spent with Hale, who had become, unexpectedly, one of her most enthusiastic supporters, eager to document her grandmother's teachings properly, so they would never again be lost to fear or prejudice. "I still don't fully understand the science behind it," Hale admitted one afternoon, reviewing notes together in the small study Clara had been given. "But I've come to accept that understanding isn't always necessary for something to be true and valuable." "My grandmother used to say something similar," Clara said, smiling faintly at the memory. "She said not everything worth knowing could be explained, only observed and respected." Word of what had happened spread slowly through the kingdom, carefully shared by the king himself in a public address acknowledging the crisis his son had survived, without revealing every detail of the political conflicts that had unfolded behind palace walls. He spoke instead of the courage found in unexpected places, of the danger of dismissing knowledge simply because it did not come wrapped in familiar authority. The pack listened, many with surprise, some with lingering skepticism, but slowly, attitudes began shifting. Old healers, who had once hidden their practices out of fear, began stepping forward cautiously, offering knowledge long kept silent, encouraged by the king's public acknowledgement that such wisdom deserved consideration rather than immediate dismissal. Kellen found himself seeking out Clara's company more frequently than official duties required, drawn to conversations that felt different from the careful formality expected within palace walls. He asked about her grandmother, about the childhood she had spent listening to stories most had long forgotten, and in turn, he found himself sharing pieces of his own life rarely discussed with anyone beyond his closest family. "I used to resent the pressure of being heir to this kingdom," he admitted one evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens beneath a moon that no longer held any threat over him. "Everyone expected strength, certainty, the kind of leadership my father embodies without hesitation. I never felt entirely capable of matching that." "Strength isn't only found in certainty," Clara said quietly. "Sometimes it's found in admitting what you don't know, and being willing to listen to those who might." Kellen glanced at her, something warm and genuine passing between them in the quiet evening air. "You taught this entire kingdom that lesson, whether you intended to or not." Clara felt her cheeks warm again, though she no longer flinched from his attention the way she once might have, uncertain of her place beside someone of his standing. Something had shifted between them over these past weeks, built slowly through shared danger and quiet gratitude, into something neither of them quite dared to name yet, though both seemed to sense it growing steadily beneath the surface. Mrs. Bramwell, who had once dismissed Clara's concerns so harshly, approached her cautiously one afternoon, her expression carrying an unfamiliar humility. "I owe you an apology," the head housekeeper admitted stiffly. "I dismissed you without giving your concerns proper consideration. That was a mistake I won't repeat." "Thank you," Clara said simply, understanding how difficult such an admission likely was for someone who had spent years enforcing strict boundaries between servants and those they served. Even Garrick, the guard who had first turned Clara away, found himself treating her with newfound respect whenever their paths crossed within the palace halls, a quiet nod of acknowledgement replacing the dismissive indifference he had once shown her. As the following full moon approached, Clara found herself watching the sky without the fear that had gripped her during those desperate early days. Kellen stood beside her in the garden, his health fully restored, his presence beside her no longer marked by weakness or uncertainty, but by quiet strength and genuine warmth. "Thank you," he said softly, watching the moon rise slowly above the palace towers, "for believing in something everyone else dismissed, even when it would have been far easier and safer to stay silent." "I couldn't stay silent," Clara admitted. "Not when I believed I might hold the answer everyone else had missed." "I'm grateful you didn't," Kellen said, his voice carrying a warmth that went beyond simple gratitude, something deeper and more personal beginning to take root between them. Aldrich, watching quietly from a nearby balcony, observed his son standing beside the maid who had saved his life, and found himself reflecting on how dramatically his understanding of strength and wisdom had shifted over these past difficult weeks. He had built his rule on certainty and tradition, believing power alone could solve any problem placed before him. Yet it had taken a humble kitchen maid, armed with nothing more than her grandmother's forgotten teachings and unwavering courage, to save what all his power and resources could not. The kingdom had survived a crisis that nearly cost it everything, not through strength of arms or the finest physicians money could summon, but through the quiet, persistent courage of someone the world had once overlooked entirely. And as the moon rose fully above the palace that night, casting its familiar silver light across grounds once filled with fear and uncertainty, Clara Doyle stood beside the prince whose life she had saved, finally understanding that her grandmother's forgotten wisdom and her own quiet courage in refusing to stay silent had changed not only one life, but the future of an entire kingdom.